Welcome to this week. Today we're going to be talking about honing and editing. These are what you're going to be doing in these next couple of weeks now that you have your first draft done. So the first draft has been completed. You've got the second and third draft coming up. So let's just take a look at some techniques to do this. Editing is what I really enjoy the most about the writing process. I don't know if you remember from my introduction, but I'm a fiction writer for the most part, and I enjoy the writing process, but I really enjoy the editing process because it takes the story or whatever I'm writing from being just a thing written on a piece of paper to really becoming what it should be, becoming the story. So my thought on editing is that it's very important. It is definitely not to be forsaken in your writing. I'm going to say this now, and you're going to hear me say this a few more times. Do not ever submit something that has not been edited at least one time. It should be edited more than once, if possible, but do not submit anything, even a draft, before editing. So the general definition of editing is just a basic look at your work, seeing what's wrong, what's right, what you need to do. A more specific definition is the process of which makes your writing turn from okay to great. And it is definitely a process, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Editing is the bulk of the writing. Sure, you can spend 100 hours writing a novel, but then you're going to spend 300, 400, 500 hours doing the editing. It's a big process, but it's definitely pays off at the end. So it's the bulk of the writing. When you're editing with short pieces, it might take you not very long, but editing short pieces is great because what you're doing is you're taking and you're finding the most important pieces of information or the most important storytelling, the most important writing, and you're putting it all together and you're making it as strong as possible. Or when you're editing longer pieces, think about some of the longest books that you've read or longest articles. Sometimes there is a difficulty from the writer's point of view from keeping continuity from the beginning to the end. And so when you're editing longer pieces, you have to keep in mind the whole writing project as a whole, just so you can make sure that you have been correct and have the best continuity within the writing itself. Make sure that you're telling the same story or the same research or whatever from the beginning and all the way to the end. So with longer pieces, it's going to take longer. I personally think that editing is fun. I like to see a page with, I usually edit in a color that's not black or blue so I can see it easily. So I sometimes edit in green or sometimes red. It doesn't really matter, but when I edit, I like to see the colors and changes jump out at me. So it's fun for me. It is really enjoyable. But as I said before, with that 100 hours writing and 400 hours editing, it's definitely time consuming. It's time consuming because you're looking at every word and every sentence and every phrase and every page, making sure that they are as strong as possible, that they fit in everywhere. I have spent time editing an hour for one page of my own writing. I've also spent the next page of that same book or same article or same short story, I've spent 15 minutes. So it just depends on the writing process, what you're going through, but it's definitely time consuming. So when you're editing, you need to make sure that you carve out enough time to edit your work. And it can be frustrating. That's because there's stuff you're reading, you could be writing it or editing it, and then you see, oh, there's something else that I wanted to say, something else that needs to be said. So going back into it, it can be frustrating because once you've made all your changes, then you have to go through it again to make sure that you've cleaned it up. And it can be frustrating on that front. So just be prepared for that. Don't try to edit the day before the paper is due. Give it some definite time. But all of that to say, it is definitely worth it. Editing is worth it. It's worth it. It's very worth it. Don't skip it. So all this talk about editing, you got to talk about what you do before you edit. I know we might have just jumped ahead around giving you the idea about editing, but before you edit, I've got some suggestions. First thing that you're going to want to do, or the first thing that I do, is I print out my work. Doesn't matter if it's one page, doesn't matter if it's 500 pages. I print it out. And the reason for that is because I can see the work as a whole on the printed paper. You can't always see the whole assignment or the whole writing chunk on your computer screen. And when you print it and when you hold it in your hand, there's going to be a connection to it. You're going to see the continuity. You're going to remember it better if you hold it in your hand. It is, I don't have the scientific proof with me, but there is a definite scientific fact with holding a piece of paper and editing it, or holding a book and editing, you're going to remember more. So you printed it, and then you're going to read it. So I suggest that you read it out loud. When you read it out loud, you can hear where there are some places in your writing that just aren't straight. They're just not strong. So when you read it out loud, you're going to hear it. You're going to feel where the words are just odd. I can't say that it's not weird, because it is. The first time you do it, if you live in the dorms and you do it and your roommate comes in and sees you reading your paper out loud to nobody, it's going to be weird, but it's definitely helpful. And if you feel kind of weird by you reading it out loud, then have somebody read it to you. So you can make notes while you're listening to it, or maybe have two copies. Somebody's reading it to you and you are reading it out loud. I mean, you're reading it along as they are reading it out loud, and you can make notes on your paper. And just be prepared to edit a few times. I suggest that you need to follow a few guidelines when you're editing. You don't have to do these in any specific order. You don't have to do this at a specific time. You can do them all at one time, but there are things you need to look for. So when you're editing, you want to look for your grammar. Make sure your grammar is correct, always. Make sure you're not changing tense. Make sure you're not changing point of view. Make sure that you have the correct word. And remember, just because there is not a red squiggly line under it, doesn't mean that it is not an incorrect word. If it's spelled correctly and it works correctly in the sentence, then Word is not going to pick it up. It's not going to say this is wrong. So there's sometimes when you're using the word defiantly instead of definitely, your word processor is not going to pick that up and say this is spelled wrong, because if you've spelled it correctly, even though it's using the wrong word, you might miss it. So look for the grammar, look for the flow. This means just look for the way that the sentences and paragraphs work together. Is anything stilted or using the same sentence structure over and over and over again? Make it so the paper just feels like it flows through smoothly. You also want to read and look for the strong transitions. I've mentioned these a couple times. Transition from one idea to another, to the next, and one paragraph to the next. So the strong transitions, make sure that they are there. And what you want to specifically do always is make sure you're staying on target. You got to stay on target with your writing. Don't meander, don't follow down rabbit holes that you have maybe done some extra research on something. Stay on target, because you have a specific word count, a specific page count, and you don't want to go over that. and there's no reason to. So just stay on target with your writing, stay in the direction. So make sure that every word counts basically as you're editing. So I'm going to talk about a few editing techniques here. One editing technique that you can do is you can begin after you've read it through straight from top to from first page to last. Then when you're sitting down to make changes, you can start backwards. Look at the last line or the last paragraph and edit that one, and then go up one more and keep going backwards until you hit the first paragraph. And the reason for that is that you are getting a different view of your work. You are finding the editing for the word's sake, not for the research sake. If you read in a certain direction, if you read in from the front to the end, you're going to sometimes get lost in your own writing, and that's okay. But when you edit backwards from the bottom to the top, you're forcing yourself out of the comfort zone of reading from front to back, and you can see the words for themselves. You can edit one line at a time. That's just taking a single sentence at a time and making sure that they are grammatically correct, all your spelling's correct, that kind of stuff. Or you can edit one paragraph at a time. This would be, you just cut out a single paragraph and edit that for its sake. And since you're writing on topics, you might want to edit one topic at a time. So if you have 3 or 4 paragraphs on one topic, take that and just edit that. Make sure that you are transitioning between each paragraph correctly and your topics are cohesive, or your discussion of the same topic is cohesive. You're not going off base during your paper. There's another technique, and this is a technique that I have used, and it has helped me a lot, especially when I've written something and I'm very close to it and I've got to turn it in much sooner than I would like to. So this special editing technique is a little bit different. So what I do is I take my paper and I, like the whole paper as it's printed out, let's say it's 15 pages. I print it out, make sure they're numbered pages, and I just drop it on the floor. And as you drop it, the pages fly out everywhere. So what that does is it just mixes up the pages. So you're not editing a specific number or a specific direction. You're editing a page for a page's sake, and you're not getting caught up in your own writing, your own research. And it helps. It gives you a bit of a distance. It forces a bit of a distance. So you can drop it, or you can just take it like you're mixing cards, and you can just mix the pages together. So take page 1, put it under page 5, page 2, put it under page 7, page 3 under page 18, or whatever. Just mixing the pages in together like that. That works as well, and it does the same thing as dropping it, except you don't get it all over the place. Another thing that I like to do, and I'm serious, I have done this before, is just throw the paper in the air. And it really helps. And this is why I said you got to make sure that they're numbered. So when you put it back together, you know exactly which pages follows, whatever. But you throw it in the air, it does the same thing as dropping it, but it can be a little freeing to just take the papers and throw them up in the air. It can really help you. So give it a try. If you feel like it's getting kind of boring, then drop it on the ground, mix the papers up, or just throw it in the air. Do something. It should be a little bit fun. You've written the paper, so why not, right? So after you've done the editing, then on to the revising. This is where the real writing happens. This is where you're making all the changes. This is where you are adding and subtracting. This is where you are tightening all the writing. So you've written your first draft. You've gotten it down. You have gotten your information on the page. That's great. then your first revision after you've done your first draft and your first edit is really directing the writing. It's putting it in the place where it needs to be. And because you are trying to put your writing in a place it needs to be, I suggest that you take some time for personal distance from your writing. So if you can, write it on Monday and put it in the drawer until Wednesday before you take it out to do your editing and your revising. It'll give you some personal time. It'll be cathartic. It will give you a peace because you know, yes, I'm going to edit it. I don't have to edit it right now. And when you do that, you're going to be able to find that you might be reading it with new eyes. Hey, I didn't remember writing that. Or, oh, I was really not paying attention when I was writing this, so I missed the point. So the distance that you have from your writing, like physically taking 2 or 3 days before editing, it really does help. And also, as you're editing and you're doing your revising, you're doing a strengthening and improving of your work. Every time you edit, you should be strengthening your work. Every time you revise, you should be improving your work. And that's not just in spelling and grammar, that's in the wording. Finding the correct revisions. One of the first short stories that I ever wrote completely, and then finally I self-published a collection of them. I did a small print run of them, and I don't know how many times I edited the paper. My dad helped me because he's a professional editor, and he edited the work probably 10 or 15 times on his own, and then I did 30 or 40 times on my own. So just to strengthen and improve it. Now that was for a different reason than what you guys are doing, but it definitely strengthened my work and it improved it. And I was very proud of that. So some of the stuff you want to look for when you're writing, when you're editing and you're revising. Basically, you want to cut the extra and cut the wrong words. Now that's easy for me to say, but it's not always easy to explain. So there's just a couple things. I don't have many examples here because it's going to be different for everybody, but some of the stuff that I see all the time is the word that. Typically, the word that can be removed from almost any sentence. So if you have a sentence with the word that in it, try it first by cutting it and then read it again. If it makes sense without the word that, then you're good. I would say that you would be just fine with leaving it alone without the word that in there. Another word I see a lot is the word just. Just doesn't typically fulfill much of a purpose. It's the same thing as that. If you are looking through your writing and you see the word just, I suggest cutting it and then reading it and seeing if it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't. These words exist for a reason. Doesn't mean you always have to cut them out, but they can be extra words just padding for some reason. That they're the typed equivalent of or that and just. And then make sure you're watching your pronouns. You should stay away from, at all possible, second person pronouns. So pronouns of you, that should not be in your paper unless it's a quote. You, Y-O-U, should be cut from your papers. Also make sure your pronouns are correct in the writing itself, and make sure that the pronouns are not confusing. If you're going to use a pronoun, here's the best way to do it. If you're going to use a pronoun, make sure you have used the proper noun first. So instead of saying, he went to the store, John bought some soda, say, John went to the store, he bought some soda. It's much clearer if you name the person first and then use a pronoun later. So that would go with your research as well. So make sure that your research, you are introducing your expert before using the pronoun that's related to them. So make sure you're doing that. And also, I suggest that you stay away from first person in your writing at all times. Um, I know that you might be able to use it, so I just suggest that you stay away from first person. That is the I, and you definitely should not use we unless you are using, unless you have a co-author. So as you are doing your editing and your revising, you need to get specific. Cut the extra information. If you've already stated something 2 or 3 times, then frankly, I don't need to read it. You don't need to say it. So cut that extra information. Cut the extra research. Maybe you have 3 sources on the same topic and they each say something a little different, but maybe that third source is not really necessary because it is just it just says it one more time in a little bit different way and it's not really necessary. So cut that extra research. You've done a lot of research so far, so maybe it's just time to trim back on a quote. Now make sure you have the correct number of sources in your paper, but you cut that extra research, cut that extra quote. That'll be okay. Then cut the fat. Don't don't just write your paper to write your paper. Don't spend 3 paragraphs introducing a topic. Get get to the topic, get to the part, discuss it. Just cut all the extra fat. You also want to make sure you're not just cutting when you're doing editing, you're adding. You're going to add the necessities. There's going to be times when you think that you might have said something in your writing, but it's just not there. So you're going to have to add that research that you might have discarded earlier. You're going to have to add something that is going to add some clarity to it. So editing is not just about cutting, it's also about adding. It's about rearranging as well. So here's some takeaways concerning editing and revision. Editing and revising and rewriting, they will make your writing better. If you do it, then your writing will be better. Do not submit anything for an essay, for an assignment, if you have not edited it. Do not do it. If you don't feel like you can do it at all, utilize the Writing Center. Utilize the Office of Student Success. They are there for you to help. If it's too late or you don't trust them, then find a friend or find an editor that will go through your work. But as I've said, editing is important and it is going to make your writing stronger. So don't forsake it. Don't waste the time you've used to write your first draft and not edit it.